We have a very challenging test today. Every class, in its own way, is a challenge in our course. Usually, what's the right phrase? Usually a pleasant challenge. Today also a pleasant challenge, but a challenge of a different kind. We are going to talk about two philosophers, namely Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, both of whom are not really systematic philosophers in the sense that they do not have a system. Like the same way that for Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, this notion that we go from point A to point B, this is by and large not going to be true for Nietzsche and Foucault. Okay, they're doing their own thing. So another thing I should say immediately before we begin is that Nietzsche is a thing of its own kind. I mean, to even call Nietzsche a philosopher is a very strong claim. Nietzsche is beyond all of this. He's beyond philosophy, beyond good and evil. So, and I'm not saying this to disparage Nietzsche. I agree completely. I think Nietzsche is dynamite. And to a very large extent, I think that Nietzsche circles the forefront of our intellectual horizon today. Nobody, I think, can claim to be beyond Nietzsche. No philosopher, no intellectual. We'll keep talking about in this course, so we have this history of ideas. But how about today? Well, I want to say that to a very large extent, like 99%, that people whom we talk about in this course, especially in the later part of this course, people like Hegel, well, Hegel is less popular these days, but especially Marx and Mill and Nietzsche, whom we're going to talk about today, these people form the absolute backbone or background of our present-day intellectual culture. So the cutting-edge philosophers today respond to them. And in an important sense, I don't think that we have been able to move beyond the horizon, which was laid down by people like Nietzsche, Mill, and Marx. Well, again, usually I talk about Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. It's a popular way of Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. We're not talking about Freud, but Marx, Mill, Nietzsche, good enough for our purposes. And by the way, immediately, I will have to talk about this at some point today. I very much, because to some extent, this is a consequence of teaching a course like this. In the sense that we are talking about all of these people together. What is the consequence? The consequence is that I tend to see these people as having a productive dialogue with one another, as mostly agreeing with one another. And this is dangerous, because in general, rationality, I mean the Latin word ratio, means division, distinction, the ability to draw distinctions between different philosophies and different philosophers. So one should not jump to conclusions that they're all talking about the same thing. But in general, I think that there's a broad basis of consensus between all the people that we study in this course, in large respect, in the sense that they can all participate in the same dialogue. And this is even more true today, because what I will insist is that we need to read Nietzsche through the lens of Marx, and also Mill maybe, but also to read Marx through the lens of Nietzsche. So basically I want to say that unless you see that there's a certain basic agreement between Marx and Nietzsche, you misunderstand both, or at least one of them. So, I deeply respect Leo Strauss, but one thing I completely disagree with in Strauss is that Strauss portrays Nietzsche as a critic of Marx. First of all, historically, that's completely not true. Nietzsche, as far as I can tell, hasn't even heard the name of Marx. You have to understand, we're not going to go into biographies, but both these philosophers only became important and popular after they died. And in fact, long after they died. So there's very little chance that Nietzsche might have heard the name of Marx. And even more so, because Nietzsche is younger. Marx, no chance would have heard the name of Nietzsche. Okay? So I think so this is first reason why we should not think that Nietzsche is a critic of Marx. Nietzsche is a critic of socialism. Nietzsche is a critic of socialism, but so is Marx, critic of socialism. And I think that their criticism of what Marx calls, for example, utopian socialism is very much similar. And again, this Nietzsche keeps talking about these last men who have invented happiness and they blame. He's not talking about communism, I think. The people whom he's talking about, broadly speaking, we can call utopian socialists, and Marx will criticize them as well. So I think this is a very strong claim on my part. So take it with a grain of salt. This is my opinion, but take it with a grain of salt. But I think it's productive to see these philosophers not as in contradiction with one another, but in basic agreement. Maybe there are some nuances to work out, so there's a room for productive dialogue, but by and large, in general, in the same general direction. And I will talk about Mill, because I think Mill and Nietzsche is the same basic thing, although I'm more interested in dialogue between Marx and Nietzsche. But Mill is part of the conversation, nevertheless. Anyway, so, so I've been talking about this, and let me go back one step. So Nietzsche is a philosopher of his own kind. He's a thinker of his own kind. He doesn't write standard philosophical discourses. He writes things which are better described as poetry. So, strictly speaking, it's very difficult to categorize Nietzsche, and it's very difficult to talk about specifically what he's talking about, like to ascribe certain doctrines to Nietzsche. And people like to quote Nietzsche, and that's the thing about it. He wrote these short aphorisms, and he has a million different aphorisms for basically every position. So, like, if you're careless, you can use Nietzsche to substantiate any position that you want whatsoever. So people have to be careful. I mean, one thing to do, one possible way to approach Nietzsche is to just let go of the brakes. Just let yourself loose. Just not, like if you're writing about Nietzsche, not pretend that you're writing about Nietzsche, but actually say, look, I'm using some phrases in Nietzsche as inspiration to go wild. Okay, that's a legitimate form. But the alternative, I think, is to be very careful with quotations and to try to find certain anchors in Nietzsche. And Nietzsche at times seems to act as if he was an academic philosopher. And the most fruitful text for that purpose is the Genealogy of Morals, and I will talk about this today. But like having said all of this, I think that Nietzsche would really hate this idea of some guy in a suit, thankfully I'm not in a suit today, some guy in a suit giving a lecture to an auditorium. I mean, you should sing about Nietzsche, or dance about Nietzsche, or kill people with a machine gun about Nietzsche, or something like that. But, not give a lecture about Nietzsche. This sounds ridiculous. So, keeping this in mind, we'll have to proceed, because this is our format. But this format is radically inadequate to talk about Nietzsche. Anyway, so, where shall we begin? Well, thank you. Let me say a couple of words of like background introduction. So more specifically, okay. So introduction. Nietzsche comes from a tradition of German idealism, and again, to some extent, I think that some of Nietzsche's positions, in Britain are PC, chicken soup. This notion of ethics does not exist in and of itself. Yeah, I mean Hobbes said this like 200 years ago, and Nietzsche. So to some extent, I think that Nietzsche is an artifact of a very strict, very puritanical culture in Germany at the time. And some of the things he says are actually very trivial. Well, I don't want to say trivial. They're trivial from the standpoint of this course. They're trivial from the standpoint of people like Hobbes or Hume. Trivial, trivial is a strong word. Not trivial, but Hobbes and Hume are in basic agreement. They've already said this without so much pomp. So Nietzsche says certain things and they appear more controversial than I think they are, because they come from this very, very conservative culture. That's point number one. But in general, Nietzsche is an heir to this tradition. So we go, if you want, we go from Hume through Kant to Nietzsche. And basically, there are several things that Nietzsche is going to take from this tradition. Let me write them quickly on the board, and then we'll see if we need to return to them later. One is this already notion implicit in Hume and Kant. We talked about this social construction of reality, that human beings do not have direct access to the world as it exists in itself. But actually, perception is part imagination. We can, in an important respect, we construct reality that we see. Again, we do not see the reality as it really is, but we are only in touch with the world of appearances. And this world of appearances is an important respect shaped by this world of appearances is an important respect shaped by our mind. The creative, productive capacities of our mind. Again, perception is part imagination. Hume has already said this. Hume says, the same way that when you look at a painting, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The beauty of the painting is in the eye of the beholder. It's not there in the painting. You see the beauty into the painting. And Hume says, in the same fashion, you see causation into the world, but the causation is not part of the world. Strictly speaking, it's part of your mind. So, and this notion of perception is a creative act, which is not unlike aesthetic judgment, or not unlike aesthetic creative act, something like that. So in Nietzsche, I'm not sure if he uses this phrase, but usually when people talk about Nietzsche, the phrase that's used is perspectivism. Perspectivism. And when I say perspectivism, the idea is that we always see the world only through a particular perspective. We never see the world as it really is. And our perspective is, in a very important way, biased. Understanding is always misunderstanding. Interpretation is always misinterpretation, because we interpret from a particular perspective, which is biased. By what? By our beliefs, values, and desires. And let me immediately write this on the board, because this is also going to be important. So we have beliefs, values, and desires. Beliefs. Broadly speaking, corresponding to the Plato's tripartite division of the soul into rational, spirited, and affective part. And now immediately what we get in Nietzsche is an interesting take on this division. This notion that actually what you believe, and especially the degree of certainty that you have, has nothing to do with truth. People can be extremely passionate about things which, by some measure can be proven to be false. I mean, again, you can look at beliefs people have held in the past. Today we consider these beliefs false, but people can believe them with very high degree of certainty, conviction. So, emotion is good, bad guide. Certainty is not equal to truth. Values, it doesn't matter how much zeal you have, again, how certain you are that your values are correct. This does not necessarily mean that your values are actually good, are actually moral. And likewise, desires, well, this is the more technical point, less interesting point, but still, desires, the fact that you crave something, the fact that you want something bitterly, does not mean it will make you happy. Say hi to Epicurus. We kind of talked about this. And in an important respect, again, so here Nietzsche anticipates Freud. Nietzsche anticipates Freud in seeing these things, if you want, again, beliefs not as true, values not as moral, and desires not as leading to happiness, but in seeing these things as certain mechanisms that control individual behavior. These are, to use a strange metaphor, these are like head cramps that attach to your head and steer you like a zombie in certain particular directions. And more specifically, certain culturally produced regimes of belief, value, and desire can be used to control human behavior. So this is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit in the second lecture. Foucault is going to refer to this as discourses. Nietzsche does not use the phrase, but he understands what Foucault is talking about. Discourses, or modes of culture, or something like that. Cultural formations, which direct human behavior by imparting certain beliefs, values. I mean, I can take your body and physically try to control it, but actually a more efficient way of controlling your body is through beliefs, values, and desires. And notice this, we're not talking about a conspiracy theory. We're talking about, if you want, in Hegelian terms, we're talking about history. And Hegel kind of talks about this, and kind of Hegel's reason. It's not that men make history, history makes men. It's not that people control culture, culture controls people. And even the individuals who are rich, powerful, famous, influential, they have themselves been shaped by culture. In some sense, it is culture which is speaking through people, and not the other way around. And culture may be bad, culture may be false, says Nietzsche, and we'll get to this in a second. Let me go back to this step. So again, the first thing that Nietzsche takes from human Kant is perspectivism. The second thing that Nietzsche takes from human Kant is the critique of the self, skepticism about the self. Let me write non-self. I could write anatman just for fun, but let me write non-self. This notion, well, non-self, but what instead of non-self? Unconscious. Nietzsche, before Freud, and again, Freud is very much influenced by Nietzsche in this respect. Nietzsche, before Freud, discovers, well, he's not the only one, he's not the first one. Nietzsche, for example, takes this already from Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer maybe takes it from somebody else. But this idea that in human Kant we have this critique of the self, this notion that we do not perceive ourselves. Like if I close my eyes and I try to introspect, I do not actually see myself. The life of my psyche, the life of my soul, is not available to me completely and clearly in all important respects. So there are certain aspects of my psyche, of my psyche, right, of my soul, which are unavailable to me, which I do not know about, which I am unconscious about. And Nietzsche has this wonderful, very short text called Über Wahrheit und Lüge in ausmoralischen Sinne, on truth and lies in extra-moral sense. And he uses in this text this metaphor of a tiger before Nietzsche. Before Freud. Freud takes this from Nietzsche. This notion that actually, we imagine that our conscious self is in control of our body, as if a rider directing the horse. But actually what happens is our body is like a wild tiger, and we, frantically try to hold on to this tiger who goes wherever he pleases. Something like that. This notion of id in Freud. Not only that, but to some extent. As Nietzsche puts this, our consciousness is far away and is shielded, not shielded, but veiled from the real workings of our body, far, as he says, from the coils of the intestines. Coils of the intestines. Do you control your body? Do you control the coils of your intestines? Or do they operate of their own, so to speak, volition, over and above what you are trying to do? Anyway, it's a complicated story, and many of you are doing presentations on Freud, so I don't need to explain unconscious, hopefully. Both of this issue of non-self is present in both human Kant in increasingly rudimentary form. And the third thing that Nietzsche takes from human Kant is the notion of fact-value distinction. So sometimes people call this Hume's guillotine or is-ought problem. I'm going to write fact-value, okay? That facts do not give us values. There is no rational morality. Kant tried to construct rational morality, but he failed. Again, this notion, well, I don't want to go into this because to some extent, so even though Kant is criticizing Hume and Kant is trying to construct rational morality, but Kant understands in general that the fact that you have a desire does not mean that it's good. Kant understands that the only thing which can be good is goodwill, which is this strange thing, part of the noumenal world, not part of this world. But in a straightforward fashion, like on the surface, Kant would agree with Hume and Nietzsche would agree with both of them, that again, facts do not give you values. Again, this something that you learned hopefully in school, that you cannot and shouldn't derive normative statements from positive statements unless you introduce normative assumptions. So normative statements can only be derived from other normative statements, not from positive. We'll talk about this today later. Anyway, so this is one way to start talking about Nietzsche. Another way to start talking about Nietzsche, kind of looking at this, is we have Kant and Hume. Where does this leave us? The place where this leaves us, according to Nietzsche, is the crisis of European culture. Deep crisis and the threat of nihilism. Why? Because, well, for many reasons actually, but maybe the most fundamental and most important reason is, for Nietzsche, is this idea that we already have in Kant and Hume, but not like Nietzsche thinks that these philosophers do not pay enough attention to it. This, again, in Kant said it best of all, right? That the universe is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Yes, this is a scientific picture, which is not really, really true. It comes from a perspective, but you see, Nietzsche is a skeptic. There's no reason to postulate any real world beyond that. Nietzsche will actually reverse the moral postulates of Kant, and I will need to talk about this in a second. But science, given the fact, even taking into account the fact taking into account the fact that science is this limited perspective enterprise which doesn't have any claim to truth with a capital T, still, the best picture of the world, it's shaky, it's not bulletproof, but still, this picture of the world is that the world is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie, in the words of Kant. And this is the biggest issue from which Nietzsche begins all of his philosophizing, the problem of meaninglessness. Okay, we'll talk about God, soul, immortality, and all this other stuff in a second. Nietzsche, in a nutshell, does not buy this Kantian picture. And remember, I mean, if you read Kant carefully, Kant tells us that we cannot know whether God exists. And like, strictly speaking, we cannot even understand the word God. But we postulate God for moral reasons, and because otherwise existence is just too hard for us, too difficult for us. And Nietzsche says, well, tough luck. That's not a very good answer. Again, there's one Nietzschean scholar, actually Nietzschean scholar, Nietzschean Christian, who maybe I'll have an occasion to mention today, Max Scheller, puts it, dass Metaphysik keine Versicherungsanstalt ist, durch schwache, stützungsbedürftige Menschen, right? Metaphysics is not first aid kit for the weak and the wounded. Sorry, yeah, if your metaphysical picture of the world is uncomfortable, that's your problem, not the problem of metaphysics. And you cannot just, because strictly speaking, again, what Kant does, and Nietzsche understands this very well, what Kant does is not called philosophy, it's called wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is not, выдавать желаемое за действительное, right? This is not proper, rigorous philosophy, okay? So Nietzsche begins with this notion of meaninglessness. And in an important sense, you can see Nietzsche as an atheist Lutheran. And I like this model, figure of speech a lot. Because of course, Nietzsche is an atheist, and we'll talk about this in a bit. And Nietzsche is probably the most atheistic philosopher of everybody in this course. But anyway, I gotta stop doing that. So he's not a Lutheran in the sense that he believes, no, Nietzsche does not believe in God in any shape, matter, or form. He thinks it's a cop-out. And he has, Kant had a moral reason to believe in God. We cannot prove or disprove. Nietzsche agrees, we cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, but he has a moral reason to disbelieve in God. He inverts Kantian formula. We'll talk about this in a second. But why am I calling Nietzsche an atheist Lutheran? Because you remember, the Catholic notion was that we have this indirect relationship with God. We do not face God directly. We face God as a part of the community of believers. We're all in this together. And that's why people can help one another, can pray for one another. But for Luther, again, in the words of Søren Kierkegaard, right? Fear and trembling. For Luther, you are alone in the face of God. And you have to justify your existence to God directly, one-on-one with God. Well, this is exactly what Nietzsche says, minus God. You have to justify your existence directly in the face of this meaningless universe. It's not God. It's not some kind of consciousness which cares about you or which is going to judge you. No, this is this black, silent abyss which silently maybe judges you or something, and you don't know what the deal is. Some kind of Lovecraftian horror of unclear universe. Anyway, and you have to justify your life in the face of that. So again, 20 minutes into the lecture, or half an hour, and finally getting to the first step in Nietzsche. The first step in Nietzsche is this. Can we, this is the question with which Nietzsche wrestles his whole life, can we affirm life in this universe, which is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of man? Can we affirm life in the face of the abyss? Can we do it? Can we say yes to life? Even though life has no ultimate meaning and no ultimate grounding, and our lives are completely, like from the objective standpoint, completely and utterly meaningless. Again, let me signal for 1 second that Hobbes, Hume, and Mill agree with Nietzsche. It's just that they don't think it's much of a problem. Yeah, life is meaningless, so we might as well have a good time. Yeah, nothing makes sense in life, so I'm just going to do things which are fun. I'm just going to amuse myself. As Hume says, I think about philosophy, and I become depressed. So what is the cure, says Hume? I just go and play a game of backgammon with my friends. Try it out. You play a game of backgammon, and your body, in some sense, takes over, and you forget all about this depressing philosophical stuff. But Nietzsche doesn't want to go that road. He says, no, let's look in the face of this abyss, and let's try to find some kind of positive solution. And many topics emerge from this initial formulation, but basically, in some sense, Nietzsche wants to say, I'll need to come back and explain this better. But Nietzsche wants to say that the only way this can be done is through your individual will. It has to be an act of individual's will to say yes to life. This is not automatic, this does not proceed from desires, this does not proceed from reason, this proceeds from will. Something like that. So, immediately, let me write something else on the board. A question to Nietzsche. You see, this is a course in social and political philosophy. But Nietzsche, and to some extent Foucault, are anti-social and anti-political philosophers. Not completely. This is a question mark. This is not a statement, this is a question. Is it the case that in Nietzsche and in Foucault we only have the individual project? Is it possible to construct a social project for Nietzsche and Foucault? This is going to be my point of discussion, point of dialogue between Nietzsche and Marx. I'll return back to this, hopefully, at a later point. Another issue which I maybe should signal on the board is again this issue of conflict and consensus that we keep circling around over and over and over again. On the surface, it seems that Nietzsche is very much on the conflict side. Like as far as you can go to the conflict side. In some sense, because of this. Because you see, the only way that you can justify your existence in the universe is by your own act of will, which is not tied to anything. In some sense, this is this Hegelian moment of pure indeterminacy. And if it has to be your own free, uncaused will, which justifies the universe, then there's no reason why these different wills have to come to the same conclusion. So, in some sense, maybe we're going back a little bit to the ancient sophists. And Callicles and Antiphon, but not Antiphon, but Callicles. Callicles is one of Nietzsche's most favorite philosophers in this issue of radical conflict, but with a question mark. We'll return back to this. On the surface, it seems that this is maybe what Nietzsche is saying, but in reality, maybe not exactly. Okay, so yeah, maybe some other things I need to talk about, but let me push forward. And let's see. If I remember, I forgot something, I'll return back to it. Okay, so let me, as briefly as I can, talk about Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. Should I talk about this book? I'm not sure, but you never know before you try it out. Okay, so let me try this out. So, Birth of Tragedy. So this is again, Nietzsche begins as a philologist. He studies Greek classics, what is the driving force behind the book? Well, you have this character who's a satyr, Silenus. He's like a demigod, right? Or like a lesser god, right? Helper of the god Dionysus. And Silenus, in one of the tragedies, one of the famous Greek tragedies, tells to King Midas. You might have heard, the one that touches everything and turns into gold, right? So Silenus tells to Midas. Midas catches him and sort of asks him, what is the meaning of human life? Something like that. And Silenus first refuses to answer, but then Midas forces him, and Silenus says, you wretched human, why do you ask me what you should not know, what is better for you not to know? And Silenus says, the best thing for the human beings is to not be born at all. And the second best is to die as soon as possible. So this is the challenge of Silenus. The challenge of Silenus. And Nietzsche wants to say that Greek tragedy is the best, or maybe the only possible response to Silenus. And the answer, I could go into this Apollonian Dionysian, how Dionysus is a little bit like Kantian noumena, especially in the way that Schopenhauer talks about this, and Apollo is like a Kantian phenomena. Maybe we'll talk about this in the seminar. I don't want to go there necessarily. Let me give you the gist of the answer. The gist of the answer in The Birth of Tragedy is this: that you take an aesthetic approach to life. More specifically, you imagine yourself as a spectator of a drama. So in the same fashion that people in the audience can look at terrible things happening on stage in a tragedy and enjoy it in a deep sense. So again, imagine Oedipus tears his eyes out on stage, and nobody rushes to save him. And this is, in a Greek fashion, this is meaningless. It's not leading to any conclusion or redemption. It doesn't make people's lives better. It's just, like horror for the sake of horror, pain for the sake of pain, and seemingly no gain. But the spectators can enjoy this. The spectators can enjoy the sight of this. So look at this as an aesthetic experience. And so the answer is detachment. Detachment. You assume the role of spectator, and you try to see life as an aesthetic phenomenon. And even if horrible things happen to you or somebody around you, like if you find yourself in a concentration camp or something, it's a very famous book about Nietzsche in a concentration camp. Maybe we can talk about this in the seminar. Anyway, so he who has a why can suffer almost anyhow, something like that. So anyway, so aesthetic, approach life as an aesthetic phenomenon, and this should remind us of certain ancient religious traditions, like, for example, the Buddhists, or the Pythagoreans, or actually the Gnostics, to some extent, not completely, but to some extent. Because all these three kind of, with a possible partial exception of Buddhists, because Buddhism is complicated, believe in the afterlife, but still, the idea in all three religions is that, again, Pythagoreans have this, I'm not sure if it's going to clarify anything, but Pythagoreans have this very famous figure of speech. They say that there are many kinds of people who come to the Olympic Games. Some people come to compete, some people come to place bets, but the best ones are the ones who come to spectate. So people who wade through life, maybe in a Zen-like Buddhist fashion, sticking with things without getting stuck with them, just letting everything flow as if as a water over them, enjoying it in an aesthetic fashion, but without giving it too much attention. Maybe this should much better remind us of Sextus Empiricus. Because this is Sextus's solution for ataraxia, right? So you understand that in an important sense, this world is just a dream. It's not really real. It is like again, as the Buddhists say, veil of Maya, and you detach yourself from the world. The difference between Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy and Sextus is because Sextus kind of wants to see it as just an illusion, and Nietzsche wants us to see this as an illusion, but to find pleasure in this illusion, some deeper aesthetic pleasure, like relish in it. And okay, there's all sorts of stuff about how the Dionysian Horus has an Apollonian dream, but maybe I should not talk about that and push forward. So this is the early solution that Nietzsche proposes. But again, it's very important that this life for Nietzsche is all that there is. It's not like, oh, I just need to be a spectator and wait until this life is over and something more interesting will begin. No. This life is all that there is. Remain faithful to the earth. But this is how we go about this. Later, Nietzsche becomes deeply dissatisfied with this idea. And in order to explain Nietzsche's later philosophy, we need to go through probably the most important conception, piece of philosophy in Nietzsche, and also the most productive for the purposes of our class in terms of social and political philosophy. And this is the book, The Genealogy of Morals. The Genealogy of Morals. Let's talk about that. So, this is The Birth of Tragedy. Let's go to Genealogy of Morals. So this is going to be slightly complicated, but hopefully not too complicated. Well, let's see how we do. Genealogy of Morals talks about something. What is it? Is it an ideal type, or are we talking about real history? And the answer is, it's kind of unclear. But what Nietzsche is trying to do is maybe to paint something like a state of nature. Again, always with a question mark. It's a little bit similar to what Hegel does in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And certainly, Nietzsche is a very careful reader of Phenomenology of Spirit, and he's partly, I don't want to say very careful, but he's certainly familiar with Hegel's philosophy. And certainly he's inspired in part by Hegel's philosophy when he talks about reasoning. Okay, this should be clear, hopefully. So we begin our journey in the Genealogy of Morals. And in some sense, the question is, where does our culture get its values? We begin with what Nietzsche calls master morality. Master morality. And master morality is primary in the world. It exists before and independently of any other forms of morality, including, very importantly, slave morality. And master morality is characterized by this distinction, by this naturalistic, natural distinction between good and bad. So Nietzsche wants to say, in some kind of quasi-naturalistic fashion, in nature, objectively, certain things are good and certain things are bad. Later on, when we get to Übermensch, he's going to make this picture more complicated, but this is the beginning. See, a river flowing free, this is good. A river obstructed by dikes and dams, this is quote-unquote bad for the river. There's a healthy, tall, strong tree. There's a short, diseased, dying, or I don't know, already dead tree. There's a knife which cuts well. There's a knife which cuts poorly. There's a marker that writes well. There's a marker that writes poorly. So we're talking about some kind of objective characteristics which exist in the world. So this is master morality, and this is like universal morality for the whole universe, including for the animals. But we are talking about some kind of beings which maybe are people, although for Nietzsche it's not exactly clear, because Nietzsche says that the slave revolt begins when animals crawl out of the sea and begin to walk on land. So I'm not exactly sure that we are talking about human beings. So how is this supposed to map onto evolutionary history? That's a separate question. But for our purposes, it's not important, because we will be able to understand what we're talking about. So master morality is this natural, and this distinction is between good and bad. And what is also important is that masters, in a very important fashion, it's as if they do not have self-consciousness. There is no self-consciousness. There is consciousness, but without self-consciousness. Consciousness without self-consciousness. So you act without reflecting on your actions. There are deeds, but there's no separation between the deed and the doer, and there's no separation between the deed and the intention. Again, simple example will illustrate. It's not like the lion intends to eat the sheep, right? The lion just eats the sheep. It's what the lion does. The lion eats the sheep the same way that the lightning strikes the ground. It is a direct expression of, an interesting phrase in Nietzsche, will to power. So let me write this on the board, will to power. But if we don't want to use this technical phrase, again, it's a direct expression of its nature. And the lion does not think that the sheep is bad. The lion thinks that the sheep is very good. The sheep is tasty. It's wonderful. The hawk eating the dove. So this is where we begin. So this should and could remind us of Hegel. And maybe this is a good time, as good a time as any, is to remind ourselves. Oh, it's always very nice to see marks on the board from last time. Anyway, so in Hegel, Hegelian dialectic, and I'm going to do something very controversial. I'm going to try to explain Nietzsche through Hegelian dialectic. So we begin with undifferentiated unity. Undifferentiated unity. We go through the differentiated disunity, you remember? And we end up in differentiated unity. And masters are like this undifferentiated unity. Master morality is here. Masters just are. And again, same way as masters for Hegel. Hegel says the same. Again, Hegel also has a master-slave dialectic. It's different and similar. Similar and different. But Hegel and Nietzsche agree that masters, in some sense, do not have self-consciousness. They just act. Mm-hmm. And remember how in Hegel we have this two, and again, what was it? Is this state of nature? Is this human beings by nature? Is this history? Hard to say. This is some kind of a metaphor or a model which is supposed to explain something about reality. So this has relationship to reality, but direct relationship is kind of hard to say. Hopefully it will become clearer by the end of the lecture, and hopefully maybe in the seminar we'll also talk about this. Anyway, so the undifferentiated unity. consciousness without self-consciousness. Consciousness without self-consciousness. Okay. So yeah. And Hegel has this next stage in the story, and the next stage in the story for Hegel is a defective master comes on the scene. Let me explain this a little bit clearer. So a master sees another master. Do they have to fight? For Hegel, yes. For Nietzsche, not exactly. For Nietzsche, they don't necessarily have to fight, but they could fight. And if they fight, again, the master, and you should think, because again, even though this is ideal and abstract, this has some relation to reality. So if you want to find these things, some kind of prototype of this in reality, you can look at morality of Homer in the Iliad. So as a master, somebody like Achilles, does he want enemies? Yes, he wants enemies. Does he want to fight with them? Yes. He wants the strongest enemies possible to either win against them and show his superiority, or if he gets killed, he wants to be killed by the strongest master around. And it's like you engage in this, the masters engage in this mortal combat, and if they win, more glory to them. If they die, well, at least they had a good time fighting to the death. But here comes, again, like in Hegel, on the scene emerges this defective master, not a master anymore, who's afraid to die. And instead of dying, he submits. I'm saying he or maybe she, whatever. I mean, it's creatures crawling out of the sea, right? Anyway, so he or she submits to the master and decides to become a slave. And so here we get the emergence of slave morality. And we'll talk about this. And slave morality is not natural, it's secondary. It's derivative from master morality. You can have masters without slaves. You cannot have slaves without masters, from Nietzsche. And slave morality is not about good and bad. And this was natural, good and bad. And this one is fake. Let me write the word fake on the board. This is fake, good and evil. It's a lie. Or you could say it's a certain perspective, because Nietzsche asserts in one of his works that what is truth? Nothing is true. Truth is just a lie that has been repeated enough times. Something like that. Anyway, but still. So it's so good and evil. And if this was a natural distinction between good and bad, like again, naturally, like the free exercise of power, here the slaves are taking the bearing from the masters. They are defining evil as what the masters are. Whatever the masters are. And the good with whatever is not master. And specifically, they identify evil with power, and they identify good with, let's say meekness. Meekness or weakness. Something like that. Now, obviously, and again, so this is like a very abstract model which has relation to reality, but its relation to reality is complex. It's like a model which can explain certain things about reality. One thing that it captures about reality for Nietzsche is the relationship between Roman Empire and Christianity. The Judeo-Christian tradition for Nietzsche is mostly this. I say mostly because this is an ideal type and it doesn't fit exactly with everything that Judeo-Christian tradition says. And very, very interestingly, because again, Nietzsche is this man of constant controversies and nuances. He hates Christianity, but Jesus was an Übermensch. Or at least, in some of his moods, Nietzsche is willing to say that. But anyway, so we get this slave morality, which is associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Again, was Nietzsche an anti-Semite? No, all sorts of reasons why not. But most important reason is because this is not anti-Semitism. He criticizes a certain mode of thinking, regardless of whichever ethnicity or religion adheres to this. And whatever he says about the Jews, it's 10 times true of the Christians. Now, if the Jews are bad, Christians are 10 times worse for Nietzsche. Anyway, even though, again, Nietzsche says that there was only one Christian and he died on the cross. Everybody else are fakes, fake pretenders. Anyway, so this is the slave revolt, and the slave revolt kind of revels in this. And notice for Nietzsche, this is the first in the world. This is the first revaluation of values. Revaluation of values. Values get revalued for the first time by the slaves. The slaves invent this new morality, which is faith that goes against it. And they invented, notice, this is also an expression of brute power. The slaves are weak. That's why, in order, like, the slaves could just think to themselves in their own head, oh yes, we are weak, we are wretched of the earth, woe be to me. Something like that. But that's deeply unsatisfying, that's painful. So in some kind of Freudian fashion, they sublimate this pain. They try to redirect this pain. They try to redirect this misery in a productive fashion. And so what they do is they invent this lie. Because again, this is ideology. Marx talks about something like this. Ideology could be an intentional lie, but also ideology, for both Marx and Nietzsche, could be a product of your standpoint in the world. So ideology could be an intentional lie by the slaves, but it might as well just be a natural product of their condition. A natural product of their condition. Again, slaves are not evil in this sense for Nietzsche, that they somehow invent this. No. Notice, this is a structural approach. The slaves are not, quote unquote, to blame. The slaves are not free to create this morality. They create this morality as a defense mechanism against the world which is hostile to them. They are not to blame. This is a defense mechanism, if you want. Let me write this on the board. Defense mechanism. And a couple things I need to mention before I forget is we need to talk about priests and we need to talk about conscience. So basically, I could talk about this for a long time. Let me say this as briefly as I can. Nietzsche insists that actually, the slaves are unproductive. The slaves are wretched and downtrodden. What can they invent? Can they invent new morality? No, says Nietzsche. But you have these people who are the priests. And who are the priests? The priests are the defective masters. The defective masters, what's the right phrase? They occupy a middle position between masters and slaves. Yes, priests are masters, but they are weak masters who cannot compete with other masters on equal terms, and that's why they decide to co-opt the masses for their purposes. Think of ancient Rome, Gracchi brothers. If you know more about Roman history than I do, let's talk about this in the seminar or something. My impression of this is that the Gracchi brothers are nobles, of course, but they cannot compete with the established Roman nobility. That's why they cheat. They try to mobilize the masses for their cause. Is it because they care about the masses? Of course not. They don't care about the masses. They're just using the masses to get ahead. And this is, in Nietzsche, the ultimate critique of all social justice. Social justice? What are you talking about? Social justice is only a pretense for the defective masters to get ahead. Can you think of examples? Let me write social revenge. Can you think of examples where people try to mobilize the discourse of social justice, but they do this only for their own gain? Okay, they accuse somebody of racism or sexism, but not because they care about racial or gender equality, but because they simply want to get ahead. Like members of faculty would accuse other members of faculty, not because they care about gender equality, but because they want to get this teaching position and want to get this person fired and out of the way. This is for Nietzsche the ultimate explanation of the origin of the slave morality. And so the priests, again, defective masters, create this narrative, and they implant this narrative into the minds of the slaves, and the slaves gladly accept it. Ideology. It's an important topic. We'll talk about this maybe more in the next class. So, what happens? And okay, let me jump one step ahead and ask ourselves: this is good and this is bad. No, says Nietzsche. This is to some extent a fall, but you maybe compare this a little bit to Rousseau. But this fall is actually productive. So even though human beings become bad and wretched and miserable in this transition from master morality to slave morality, and again, this is in some sense Nietzsche imagines that this is a conflict which rages on every day in people's souls to this day, every century, every decade, every year, and every day. You have this playing out of master morality versus slave morality. Like in this room right now, Nietzsche would say, to some extent at least. But he would also associate this with the transition of the Roman Empire, how the Roman Empire abandons its old gods and becomes Christian, and by the way, falls immediately. Which is why many historians, like Edward Gibbon, for example, thought that Christianity is actually the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. So it's an oversimplification, but it's not a stupid thought. Maybe he's confusing cause and consequence, but maybe Christianity is more of a symptom rather than a cause. But that's a separate question. I don't want to go there. So Nietzsche says this is bad. This is a tragedy, but it's a productive tragedy because even though humans become bad, humans become interesting. They acquire self-consciousness. Let me write the word conscience on the board. Conscience, right? Conscience, совесть, self-consciousness, самосознание. So we go from the undifferentiated unity of consciousness without self-consciousness, we go to the differentiated disunity. Now we have a consciousness plus self-consciousness or conscience. So self-consciousness or conscience. Самосознание или совесть. So you don't just act, but you can also decide how to act. You don't just experience the world, but you also describe your experience. And what becomes possible on this stage is, for example, the notion of sin. In master morality, the word sin is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't exist. But here, you do something, and it's pleasurable, it's enjoyable, but you also think about this, that it is bad, it's evil, that you should not do that. So you like have this internal, differentiated disunity, internal conflict. And this is the slave morality. But the slaves move, like in Hegel, the slaves move the dialectic forward. So what you get at the final stage is the differentiated unity of the Übermensch. So basically, what the Übermensch is supposed to do. So the Übermensch, so Übermensch, Overman or Superman, whatever. Maybe an ideal type, because again, Nietzsche is very demanding in terms of his description of the Übermensch. Can we really become Übermensch? It's a complicated question, but maybe to some extent we can aspire. Again, it's an ideal type. The real type, I can imagine, would be the combination of all three for most people, barring some extreme circumstances. But what the Übermensch does is an attempt to return to master morality. But the Übermensch is not just a master, because the master is unreflected. The Übermensch, if you want, is the synthesis, the Hegelian synthesis of master and slave morality. Now, what does the Übermensch take from slave morality? Well, again, Nietzsche has this story. You might have heard this story, the story of 3 stages. That on the road to Übermensch, first we become camels, the spirit becomes a camel, then the spirit becomes the lion, and finally the spirit becomes the child. So the stage of the camel is the stage of the slave, if you want. So this is the stage of the slave, this is the stage of the master, and this is finally the stage of Übermensch. But these are stages on the way to Übermensch. It doesn't mean that all people go through these stages or something like that. So on the first stage, the camel. So why the camel? The camel is an image of an enduring animal. The animal who takes a load upon itself. And what the camel does, what the camel signifies for Nietzsche is self-discipline. That on the road, and this is what we want to take from a slave morality, isn't this very similar to what Hegel is talking about? And I think, yes, this is very similar to what Hegel is talking about. Remember, so the slave consciousness works for another, but in working for another, it acquires the capacity to work on itself and to change itself, to become a master of itself. Again, this is a Rousseauian idea. You see, I keep talking, it's scary how much it seems to me that all the people we talk about in this course are in basic agreement. Again, Rousseau says, the only freedom is obedience to the law that you have prescribed to yourself. The only freedom is the obedience to the law that you have prescribed to yourself. This is the savage. The savage has no freedom for Rousseau in this sense. The savage is just slave to passion, one-dimensional, without self-consciousness. But only the true citizen can be a master of himself because he prescribes the laws of himself. But in order to be able to prescribe the law, you need to go through the stage of civilization. And so let me write self-discipline. Let me, by the way, mention that since we're talking about conscience and self-consciousness, especially self-consciousness, this is a stage in which language appears in an important respect. Language, Sprachlichkeit, human beings become linguistic. Language is important. Language allows us notions of sin. Language can make us very unhappy, and language allows lying, and very importantly, lying to ourselves. But also, only language allows us to be truly free in the end. So language enables lying, but also enables lying to oneself, but also enables true freedom. The stage of the line, okay, very controversially, let me signal, triple exclamation points, very controversially. I think that the stage of the line, the next stage, is Hegel's stage of pure indeterminism. This is what Hegel calls abstract personhood. Pure indeterminism. Pure indeterminism. So again, so on the stage of the camel, the spirit takes, exercises its self-discipline. It takes upon itself a load, an external load, because again, the spirit doesn't yet produce anything of its own. It takes external things and it submits to external things. Like, the first level of education. Like, you go into the university or the school, you don't have any knowledge of your own. You cannot create any knowledge of your own, and you just self-discipline yourself, and you burden yourself. You load yourself up with knowledge, but also precepts, but also commands and values of other people around you. This is the first necessary stage. But the second stage is once you have achieved a certain level of self-discipline, you have to say no. So the lion, as Nietzsche says, slays the dragon. And the dragon has these scales, and on every scale you have the words written, "Thou shalt," like commandments in the Old Testament, right? And so the lion slays this dragon of "Thou shalt." But the lion is a pure no. The lion simply says no. The lion does not create new values. The lion takes the tablets of the old values and just smashes them, right? Скрижали завета, right? Smashes them and says no to everything. Moment of pure indeterminacy. And here comes the next stage, and this is the most difficult and the most problematic stage, because on this stage you have to create new values. And how do you do this? This is a complicated and unsolved problem, okay? And in a nutshell, there is no solution. There is no solution. Somehow, artistically, creatively, whatever, you create values. Now, immediately, let me signal. So Nietzsche talks about a bunch of things. So a bunch of things which Kant talks about as moral postulates. So we have God, soul, immortality, the real world, or maybe the world after we die. So afterlife, right? What else? Freedom, very importantly, but also very importantly, freedom. Like freedom of the will. And Nietzsche thinks that all of these are symptoms of a disease of life denial. Now again, very important, Nietzsche is a skeptic. So can he prove that God doesn't exist or freedom doesn't exist? No, he cannot. But Nietzsche is going to say, nobody can prove that. It is impossible. So God, soul, immortality, real world, afterlife, freedom. We cannot prove or disprove the existence of these things. But because we cannot prove or disprove them, we have to decide whether to believe or not to believe in them on a different basis. What basis? On the basis of causes and consequences. When we talk about causes, again, Nietzsche has this word genealogy, and he uses it in a technical fashion. Genealogy, a little bit like Derrida's deconstruction, if you've heard the phrase before. So genealogy is you are, again, we don't know whether these things are true or not, but I can show you genealogically why people come to have these ideas. And in fact, I'm going to uncover genealogy, like this debunking, unmasking, deconstruction. Nietzsche is going to unmask the indecent, the base, the, what's the right phrase? Inappropriate, lowly origin of these concepts. But basically, he's going to say, well, God's soul, immortality, this is the invention of the slaves because they're slaves, they're not masters, and this is a symptom of their sickness. Of their sickness in the sense that they cannot affirm life, they cannot say yes to life. That's how they compensate. This is defense mechanism. Again, genealogy, uncovering the dirty secrets. So we're talking about causes. So the cause of these concepts is weakness and degeneracy of spirit, and the consequences of these concepts are also weakness and degeneracy of spirit. I don't want to talk about this for too long, but again, Kant has this notion that you limit reason to make room for faith. I always found this so unsatisfactory. In fact, I would even say intellectually bankrupt. How can you separate reason and faith? For a very simple reason. Because genealogically, in terms of biography, any person who believes in God, usually believes for a very particular reason. And in fact, this reason is usually boring and stupid. They believe in God because their parents told them that God is real. And it's not, it's not a good intellectual reason. And it's not all this highfalutin content I postulate for moral reasons. No, most people don't know anything about that. So, but that's the point. Nietzsche says, uncover the dirty secret, the dirty genealogical secret of how you come to have these beliefs which have no substance in reality. You cannot disprove them, but you cannot prove them either. And secondly, the consequences. And Nietzsche wants to say that to the extent that you believe in this, your life becomes bad. In this master sense, good and bad. You life denying. You do not affirm life, you deny life, and you become miserable and unhappy. So God's soul, immortality, real world, afterlife, all of this is about, this is not the real life. This life is just a preparation for the next more important life that's going to come after I die. Nietzsche doesn't like that, I mean, for obvious reasons. When we talk about freedom, this is very clear. God, like Yahweh, for example, the God of the Jews and Christians, or Muslims as well, right? Is going to look at something that you did in this life. And it's for finite transgressions, for finite crimes, it's going to send you to hell for all eternity. Does that sound just? Does that sound right? Nietzsche says, no, it doesn't sound just and right. And that's why the Christians, Jews, and Muslims have to postulate, have to invent this notion of freedom, that human beings are completely free to sin or not sin. Which, by the way, sociologically is absurd, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, from the standpoint of physics, etc., all sorts of problems with this idea. But this idea of freedom does not go away because people want to blame others. So Nietzsche says, you postulate freedom, not because you know that there's freedom, you postulate freedom because you want to blame others. And your blaming others is an expression of slave morality. Instead of cultivating your life and developing yourself, you waste time blaming others. And this is why freedom is a bad thing. So when I keep saying that for Nietzsche it's only your individual will that can create values in life, he's not really entitled to use the concept of free will. Because Nietzsche kind of says that concept of free will is problematic. Again, Nietzsche is a complicated thinker. I'm sure you can find a million quotes which support the idea that Nietzsche believes in free will. But free will, again, is complicated. It's always with a question mark for Nietzsche. Does he believe in free will? Because again, the kind of free will that Christians and Jews talk about, or Muslims, he thinks is a fake and a lie and an expression of slave morality. So I am trying to answer this question. How do you create new values? How do you create new values? And on the surface, the question seems completely impossible to answer because we're not supposed to talk about free will. And also, but somehow we have to freely decide what our values are, even though we don't have free will. How is that supposed to work? Let me cheat a little bit. Well, actually, big time. I'm going to cheat big time, and I'm going to assume that there is a solution. Now, again, triple exclamation points. This is my reading of Nietzsche. This is not everybody agrees, but what I'm going to say is that, you see, for Nietzsche, the purpose of all of this, of this picture, the meaning of the life of the Übermensch, is affirmation of life. Affirmation of life. So this naturalistic distinction between good and evil does not go away. Now, it's very important. Nietzsche, against Mill and against utilitarians, is going to say that the fact that something makes you happy does not mean it's good. You still have to freely decide, consciously decide to say, yes, I want to be happy. This is going to be my goal in life. Like this is the difference between Mill and Nietzsche. Mill is a nuanced philosopher, so I'm not really sure if there's a difference, because when we read utilitarianism, Mill kind of understands that his utilitarian proof, Epicurean proof, is not a knockdown argument. He says that basically we have to assume that happiness is the only goal in life because that's the best we can do. But he doesn't say that he has a geometric proof that that's the only thing that human beings should strive for. So I don't think that, again, Nietzsche actually knows about Mill, and Nietzsche criticizes him. He shoots all sorts of arrows at Mill. But I'm afraid that Nietzsche misunderstands Mill big time. Like he's on the surface a critic of Mill, but I think that his criticism stems from the fact that he doesn't read Mill very carefully. In fact, I'm not really sure if Nietzsche read a single word of Mill particularly carefully, especially on liberty. But he has some impression of Mill from popular culture, and he likes to use Mill as this idiotic Englishman to like target practice. Anyway, he has some juicy quotes about happiness. Yeah, the British want happiness, something like that. Anyway, go back a step. So, affirmation of life, affirmation of life. So what I want to say is that the Übermensch is going to import back master morality. So the Übermensch says yes to life. Yes to life to what? Yes to your nature. I mean, we are born with certain desires and capacities, with a certain genetic and cultural makeup. And certain things make us happy naturally. Again, in the same fashion that for a tree to grow, I mean, we understand what it's like for a tree to grow and what it's like for a tree to die. In the same fashion, so what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, what the child does, what the Übermensch does, is the Übermensch affirms what it is already, biologically, if you want. So in this sense, I want to say that there is no deep conflict between Nietzsche and Mill. This is a controversial assertion, okay? I signal this, triple exclamation point. But this is my reading of Nietzsche. So basically, what the Übermensch does is you go back to master morality, but not automatically, but in a self-conscious fashion. In a self-conscious fashion, it must be the decision of your will to say yes to your appetite. It must be a decision of your will to say yes to your appetites. And this would be like the difference between a superficial reading of Hobbes' Human Will in this course, who sort of imagine that your appetites directly tell you what is right and wrong. No, the Übermensch has to, what's the right phrase, has to look at everything and decide. And in principle, the Übermensch can decide some other values, but it seems that, again, to the extent that Nietzsche emphasizes this affirmation of life, you have to choose what like really cultivates you. And so I'm not sure if this point is perfectly clear. Let me just repeat this one last time. So the Übermensch doesn't simply go back and become a master again, because now we have reflexivity, right? Now we can think about this. And so basically what the Übermensch does is he freely chooses to become a master, but with self-consciousness. So the differentiated disunity is consciousness at war with self-consciousness, but the differentiated unity, consciousness in line with self-consciousness. And more specifically, the Übermensch creates himself as a work of art. The Übermensch first, in his self-consciousness, creates an image of himself, and then realizes this image in the real world. Creates a certain vision. Linguistic, artistic, aesthetic vision, something like that. Okay. And in some sense, I think, again, this image of a child should give us a clue. What do children do? I mean, children just express their nature. This is the point. Like children, and remember, Mill actually talks about this. How the proof that happiness is the goal of life is because everybody, including children and animals, naturally want pleasure, want to achieve happiness. And of course, when you become the child, it's important to become the child on step 3 with all the previous stages already in place. So it's like the Übermensch does not just go back and become a child, like speechless. No. But you, like, choose somebody who has already gone through steps number 1 and number 2, to say, and now try to be like a child. This is what we're talking about. It's like an adult is now trying to be like a child, trying to recapture, again, on a higher level, become a child on a higher level, like, again, in this Hegelian synthetic moment. It's not really a child like the master, but, a child with self-consciousness. Okay, let me read you one quote to try to substantiate what I just said, especially this very controversial point about Mill and Nietzsche. So Nietzsche has this phrase, in Das Spoke Zarathustra, and this is a thunderous phrase. It goes like this: what matters, this is Zarathustra speaking, what matters my happiness? It is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. What matters my happiness? It is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. So happiness is worthless. And you have, as a Übermensch, you have to understand that happiness, including your happiness, is worthless. It's not worth anything. And in fact, elsewhere in Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, the last man invented happiness and they blink. This stupid, comfortable, cattle-like existence, which for him is another form of slave morality. Comfortable existence, don't fight against others because this causes indigestion. Something like that. But he continues. Again, what matters my happiness? It is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. But my happiness ought to justify existence itself. But my happiness ought to justify existence itself. So this is what we are doing. This direct happiness of the masters, this is not interesting. But the Übermensch, on the first stage, understanding that happiness matters nothing, and then on the second stage, deciding, nevertheless, even though that he understands that happiness is meaningless, deciding to affirm happiness. This is what the Übermensch does. And again, the happiness of the Übermensch is not to be confused with the happiness of the last man. And what is the difference? Again, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat by just appealing to Mill. I think, ultimately, and this is again very controversial assertion on my part, but I think that Nietzsche and Mill agree. This is what they're talking about. What does the Übermensch do? Does he take a machine gun and slaughter people in the streets? No, because this is not interesting. This is not cultivation. It doesn't take a lot of brains. I mean, Nietzsche was a Nazi for many reasons. One is because he really only cares about the individual and not about this social project. I mean, ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. I mean, this submission to higher authority. For Nietzsche, this is slave morality. Submission to the few Führer. No. This is certainly not for Nietzsche. But another reason, I mean, this idea of guards in the concentration camp beating up helpless prisoners, that's not interesting. That's not some kind of overcoming that the Übermensch seeks for, right? So the Übermensch wants to develop its capacities to the limit, to the highest possible degree. And how do you do that? Well, again, for Nietzsche, it's very clear. The way to do this is to first and foremost cultivate your mind. This is where our capacities lie. So, cultural, philosophical, intellectual self-development, and this is exactly what Mill says. So we are talking about self-development, first and foremost, cultural, artistic, and all the rest of it. Yes, the Übermensch will despise with condescension, because you see, the masters do not care about the slaves. So the Übermensch should not care about the slaves. So if the only thing that the Übermensch does is to sort of hate on the common folk, he's not really Übermensch. Okay? I mean, he understands the difference between himself and the common folk, but in general, he's not obsessed with that. He doesn't. In fact, he shouldn't think about that as much as possible. But the Übermensch seeks what's the right phrase? Competition, recognition by others, but in artistic sphere, first and foremost for Nietzsche, because this is the highest expression, if you want, of our will to power. Because again, as like blobs of meat, we human beings are pretty pathetic. Like as a physical machine, I cannot achieve much. But my mind, in terms of creating music, art, poetry, philosophy, now that's interesting. Think of great scientists, because for Nietzsche, this would also be an expression of power. Somebody like Newton or Einstein imposes their vision of the world on millions, in fact billions. Wow, that's interesting for Nietzsche. This is how you become an Übermensch. And notice, isn't this Mill? This is exactly like John Stuart Mill. And this is so, in fact, to some extent even boring. Because who is the hero? Who is the Übermensch? Who is the ultimate Übermensch for both Mill and Nietzsche? Goethe. Right? Goethe. I mean, imagine this scenario. I've talked to some of you in the seminar about this. Imagine you come back to your parents with a tome of Nietzsche in your hand. And you say, Mother, Father, I have been reading Nietzsche. I have realized that this world is worthless, and I want to become an overman. And your parents are horrified. And they go, oh my God, what are we going to do now? And you say, I want to be like Goethe. And your parents like, this Goethe, it's not a particularly controversial figure. We keep talking about disagreements in this course, Kant against Hume and against, Hobbes and all the rest of them. But I mean, Goethe is not Hitler. Goethe is not controversial. The vast majority of people, yeah, Goethe, nice, excellent, go for it. And this is to some extent why I insist. I think it's important to read Nietzsche in the context of Mill, but also in the context of Marx. Okay, let me talk about Nietzsche and Marx for 5 seconds. So, wonderful, all of this. Differentiated unity, every class, Hegel. Unterschiedene Einheit. Anyway, so I talked about Nietzsche and Mill a second ago. Now let's talk about Nietzsche and Marx. And I want to insist that this is, again, triple explanation points. This is my own personal reading. But my own personal reading is that in order to understand Nietzsche and Marx well, we have to see them through the prism of one another. Again, the proper way to understand Marx is through the lens of Nietzsche. The proper way to understand Nietzsche is through the lens of Marx. let me oversimplify and immediately give you the answers. For Marx, communist revolution is not the revenge of the poor against the rich. So for Marx, communism is not the revenge of the poor against the rich. It's not. If it's that, it's not communist revolution. It is lost for Marx. No, for me, and Nietzsche agrees. I want to say that. Nietzsche and Marx agree. And both of them are critics of socialism. Because socialism is not about these poor and downtrodden. No, communism is a step forward for humanity. Everybody benefits. Everybody becomes, better, artistically more fulfilled, things like that. Remember, for Marx, the bourgeoisie also suffers. The bourgeoisie is also constrained by the capitalist mode of production. Only in communism will we be able to truly develop our rich and varied ability. Again, development. Nietzsche, Mill, Marx. For all three of them, the key word is development. Nietzsche, Mill, Marx, development. So only in communism we will be able to develop our rich and varied abilities, and in fact, other people will not constrain my development of rich and varied abilities, but will enable it. At the end of times, it does not constrain but develops it. For Marx. And Nietzsche agrees. And I answer this question. Do we have an individual with double question marks? Can I have a social project for Nietzsche? And my answer is, why not? Because yes, Nietzsche wants competition, and he wants these eugenic experiments and billions of people led to the slaughter. He talks about this as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is what he wants, this artistic development. Yes, he wants struggle. Struggle between whom? Between poets on who's going to be the greatest poet. Between scientists on who's going to be the greatest scientist. Between philosophers who's going to be the greatest philosopher. And this does not preclude society. Again, the Übermensch needs friends. The Übermensch wants friends. I mean, the Übermensch should also be able to tolerate solitude for a time. But the Übermensch is impossible in solitude. Again, remember, you go through these stages. At least at the stage of the camel, you need other people, you need teachers. Again, a child abandoned in the forest will not become the Übermensch. You become the Übermensch only with the help of others, culture. Nietzsche himself stands on the shoulders of the giants, of people like Schopenhauer or Kant or Hume. Where would Nietzsche be without them? Again, Hegel, yes, other people do not restrict our freedom, they enable our freedom, even for the Übermensch. The Übermensch is impossible. Without the cooperation. So again, insist on reading Marx through the lens of Nietzsche, but also Nietzsche through the lens of Marx. In the sense that the Übermensch is not about masters stepping over on the heads of the slaves. This is not some kind of masochistic. So this is again not. So for Marx, we're not talking about revenge of the poor against the rich, and in Nietzsche, we're not talking about the revenge of the aristocrats on the common folk. So this is not some kind of masochistic fantasy of domination of masters over slaves. It's not about that. Again, and Hegel knows this. Hegel writes about this. Masters do not want to have recognition of the slaves. They do not want slaves to applaud them. It's not interesting. They want to compete with other masters, and they want to be recognized by other masters. And again, like in principle, if we were different kinds of beings, maybe this would have to involve mortal combat and society would be impossible. But we are not those kinds of beings. We are not lions and tigers. Our strength lies in our capacity to think and to create, art, linguistic art, and all that kind of thing, and which does not need to lead to society collapsing. Okay. So, I don't know. I feel like to a lecture on Nietzsche, there should be some ending, but I didn't have time to think of a particular ending. So let me try to invent one on the spot. So basically, again, let's try to summarize Nietzsche in this one phrase. Again, what matters my happiness? It is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. But my happiness ought to justify existence itself. In what sense? But yes, we begin with this affirmation that the universe is meaningless. The universe is completely and utterly meaningless. And the only way that we can impart meaning to the universe is by our free decision. And again, especially Nietzsche has this notion of eternal recurrence, that you have to imagine that the history is actually not moving anywhere towards some kind of greater goal that in the future will redeem human race. No, it's leading on cyclical, a cycle of samsara, endless, meaningless stuff. And you should be able to say yes, even to that kind of existence. So again, the universe is meaningless, but by our will, we say yes to existence, we say yes to our nature. And what is it about our nature that we say yes to? Is the development of our productive capacities, and productive sounds strange, right? The development of our artistic, creative capacities, and maybe Nietzsche. We can do this in cooperation with others, which we'll talk about probably in the next class. Okay, anyway, I failed to give a bombastic ending, but whatever. I'll think of a bombastic ending for next time. So anyway, people, I hope this was interesting and fun. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer. Otherwise, thank you so very much. Next class, we need to begin with Sartre, at least for one sentence, and then we'll talk about Michel Foucault. So thank you.